Tanks are noisy. You can hear us coming miles away. So to make a long story short, we ran into an ambush. They heard us coming and they set up an ambush. All hell was breaking loose. Rockets going off, machine guns going off, grenades going off, radio chatter, people screaming, etc., etc., etc. And I'm fighting, I'm trying to lead the fight and as well as fight. And all of a sudden, bam! Somebody ran into the back of my tank to the point where the tank just jerked. I was so mad, and I'm up top. My crew is inside the tank, and I'm exposed, you know. And I'm shooting and whatever, and all of a sudden, bam! You know, and I turn around ready to yell and scream and give the one finger salute or do something with the idiot that ran into me, you know. And I turn around, and there was Sergeant Nicholson's tank hitting the back of my tank. And in between them was 3 bad guys who were climbing over the back of my tank to get at me. And Nicholson saw it, and I found out this later. It just so happens that his tank was pointing that way and my tank was pointing that way, so he told his driver, reverse, full throttle. The driver didn't know, didn't ask why, whatever, he just did it. And he squished the 3 guys that were climbing up the back of my tank to get at me. He saved my life.
Mortar rounds landed. It blew my left leg completely off. And my right leg was severely just meat and hanging together. My right hand was severed almost completely off, and I had shrapnel in arms, legs, chest, back, neck, spinal cord, and I was paralyzed from the neck down. You gotta remember, I was 18 years old. I was gonna play baseball. I was gonna be a performer. I was gonna get married. I was gonna have a home and a job and everything. And it was gone. I was going to be a burden on society. I can't even wipe my own ass. I can't feed myself. I can't do anything. And I was trained to kill with my hands, and I was so frickin' disabled I couldn't even kill myself.
What I would do is assess the patient, go over and get a name, start a chart, then look at the wounds, cut off the uniform. So even before then, they also had to be checked for weapons. Make sure they don't have a grenade or, you know, M16. So clear them of the weapons. A new nurse, you'd come in, you'd start with the head. In other words, I could take care of here, talking to them, starting the record, getting the IVs. The more experienced nurses were down there doing those amputations. So within a month or so, I had worked my way down to be able to take care of this part too. Triage means assessing all the patients and prioritizing. And that was one thing I learned to do in Vietnam. I remember thinking that, boy, if I'm good at anything, I'm good at prioritizing. I got good at it, where you decide, of course, what needs to be done right now, what can wait, what patients can get to X-ray, and then to OR, what patients can get to X-ray, and then over to the pre-op area and wait, and what patients have to go right up to that OR. Now that was the other part of this triage, is you'd also triage for the expectant patient. So that's the guy that's just going to die. And the neurosurgeon, usually those were head wounds. And of course, I didn't make that decision, but the neurosurgeons would come down and assess the head wound and decide, I can't salvage this guy. So then I would patch him up, I mean, if he was still alive, and I would take him over to the pre-op area and I'd put a screen up, and I would sit with him till he died. So that was the expectant. I mean, these kids were 18, 19. 18, 19. Very unusual to see a 20-year-old. They were 18 or 19.
I applied and was accepted to the Naval School of Diving and Salvage. And it's a 6-month-long school that included instruction in all aspects of diving. Hard hat, scuba, shallow water diving. And in my particular case, I had to spend special instruction in the recognition and treatment of diving accidents, because I became a deep-sea medical technician as well as a first-class diver. Medical corpsmen with my qualifications also served with special forces in support of them from a medical perspective. And we were few in number. And this is where I joined with UDT 11, Underwater Demolition Team. What is known as the SEAL team now was in the very early stages. As soon as I got in country, things started to happen. The calls started to come in. And, there was a little town called Quang Tri, and in order to get to Quang Tri, there was a river, Qua Viet River, and the Marines were in a heated battle up in Quang Tri, and they needed supply vessels, small supply boats, to get supplies up to them, and we were asked to go in and give them boat lanes for small craft. I guess about halfway through it, the tide started going out, and the track vehicles couldn't move. There was reports of an ambush up ahead, That made it very tense. We did have support from the Marines on each side, but those were really anxious moments.
It's an interesting thing. I mean, something like 9 out of 10 people who went to Vietnam were in the rear echelon. We were, reporters or clerks or, chaplain's assistants. And most of us never talk about Vietnam because we're embarrassed in some respects. Our society has always denigrated Vietnam, and those of us who went there, whether we were volunteers or not, we were baby killers. So we didn't want to talk about it with people who were civilians. And then we were, and I can't generalize too much, I guess, but I think a lot of us were embarrassed with other vets that we really didn't go through the combat and suffer as they did. And so we just decided to shut up about it. We talk about what being in Vietnam was like. I tell them to go read Catch-22 by Heller. And they always say, well, that's about World War II. But the absurdity that Heller talked about was the kind of absurdity that I think we all live with on a day-in, day-out basis. I was in a chopper with a colonel who got into a negotiation with a Navy commander trading a helicopter for a boat. And when I asked him why he was doing it, he said, well, I got lots of helicopters and I don't have any boats. And, I mean, it was that kind of absurdity. I was an enlisted man, and we used to eat really well because this sergeant who got me into the information office used to have a girlfriend in Denmark who would send him pornographic films that he would trade to the cooks in the general's mess. In exchange for, he would trade pornographic films for steaks and shrimp. And so we ate really well.
I lived in a village I think it was 90 days. I tell people I didn't see another commissioned officer for 90 days. I'm not sure that's exactly right, but it's close enough. It gets the point across. And we rented a cottage from these people. We provided them, the rent was sea rations, by the way. And it worked because the dietary situation was not real good. We had kids with running sores, and I had 2 corpsmen. So we would feed them, and with the food, that stuff would clear up. At least it did in that 90-day time frame. And except for the language barrier, I think the relationship with the people we were with was pretty good. I mean, we certainly liked them, and we were safe there, and they were too. However, when we left that village, and I went back by there on a patrol, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, the VC had cut off the heads of the village elders and stuck them on posts on the corners of the village. So we have the same kind of terrorism being rendered upon the Vietnamese population, by the VC, that we're seeing today. It's got to be very similar.
I had this theory that if I could build a national memorial in Washington, D.C. with the names of all the people who gave their lives, that this would have a good impact on the military veterans who served there. They would get recognized, and certainly the friends and relatives of the actual casualties would have a place to go. And thirdly, that this would be something very important for the society at large, a place of healing and reconciliation. So that was the sort of theory behind this thing. It's underground and it's black. Every other monument in Washington is white. White marble rising high and proudly into the air. This is black and buried underground. Very powerful criticism for the public, and particularly for Vietnam veterans. Oh my God, they're burying our memory. We'll never, we'll never recover from this. But we found a way to make everyone happy by making a compromise, which is what we do in Washington and Annapolis too. We found a compromise by adding a traditional element to this non-traditional memorial, which was the 3 servicemen statue. We've had, I think, 125 million visitors to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's a pretty big deal.